Portland, Oregon, known for its misty mornings and gray skies, had become home to thousands of immigrant families chasing the same fragile dream, a better life. Among them was David Lynn, a man shaped by old traditions and quiet discipline. In his early 40s, David was the kind of man who never raised his voice, never indulged in leisure, and never complained. He'd grown up in a small village in China's Fujian province, where his father taught him that a man's worth was measured by how much he could endure. So, when he finally made it to America, he carried that belief like a sacred code: work hard, save money, and never show weakness. David's wife, Mei Hua, joined him a few years later. She was younger, softer around the edges, but just as hard-working. Their marriage had been arranged through family friends back home, two families agreeing that their children would build something solid together. Love was never part of the equation. Duty was. Still, they shared the same dream: to build a life in a country that promised endless possibilities, even if those promises often came wrapped in struggle. The early years were grueling. David worked in restaurant kitchens, moving from one Chinese eatery to another, slicing vegetables, scrubbing pots, saving every dollar. Mei Hua cleaned houses and later learned to manage the books. Together, after nearly a decade, they finally opened their own small restaurant, Golden Moon Bistro, a cozy place tucked into a quiet corner of southeast Portland. The sign outside glowed a faint gold at night, a humble beacon for homesick immigrants looking for a taste of something familiar. Inside the restaurant, David ruled the kitchen. He was precise, silent, focused. Each dish came out exactly the same, every time. Mei Hua handled the front of house, greeting customers with the kind of politeness that masked exhaustion. They worked like two gears in a well-oiled machine, efficient, successful, and utterly mechanical. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect immigrant couple. In reality, they barely spoke to each other once the doors closed. Their home life was quiet to the point of suffocation. Dinner was a routine: rice, vegetables, silence. The television was always on, though neither of them really watched. David believed that providing a roof and security was enough. Mei Hua, on the other hand, longed for something she couldn't name. She would glance at couples walking hand in hand through the rain outside the restaurant window and feel an ache she didn't understand. It wasn't that she didn't respect her husband. She did. But respect had never filled the spaces that love was meant to occupy. Years passed that way. Golden Moon grew more popular. They expanded to a second location. People in the local Chinese community admired them, whispered about their success. But behind closed doors, Mei Hua felt like a ghost of her own life, a woman trapped inside the picture-perfect story everyone else believed. She smiled for customers, nodded through conversations, and carried a loneliness that no one saw. Sometimes, after closing, she would stand alone in the empty restaurant, the scent of soy sauce and ginger still hanging in the air, and wonder if this was truly the American dream, or just another kind of prison with better lighting. What she didn't know was that her quiet longing, that emptiness she tried so hard to ignore, would soon become the spark that set everything ablaze. If someone had asked, David Lynn would have said his marriage was fine. They didn't fight, they paid their bills on time, and their restaurant was thriving. To him, that was success, a partnership built on endurance, not emotion. But inside their small two-bedroom house in Portland's east side, silence had become the third member of their marriage. It lived in the corners, sat at the dinner table, and followed them into bed at night. David woke early every morning before dawn to prep for the day. Mei Hua would hear him moving around the kitchen, the rhythmic clatter of knives, the hiss of boiling water, before he left without a word. By the time he returned, long after dark, she was usually asleep on the couch, the TV flickering over her tired face. The routine never changed. Their lives ran like clockwork, reliable but lifeless. There had been moments, early on, when Mei Hua tried to reach for something more. Simple gestures, a conversation over tea, a walk after work, a smile that lingered longer than necessary. But David's responses were always polite, distant, efficient. You should rest, he'd say, or we have a busy day tomorrow. He wasn't cruel, just unreachable. He believed love was shown through labor, not words. To him, every extra shift, every long hour, was proof of devotion. To her, It was proof of absence. In public, they played their roles perfectly. At the restaurant, David was a stoic chef. Mei Hua, the friendly hostess who remembered customers' names and birthdays. People admired them, envied them even. They were proof that hard work could build a life in America. But what no one saw was a growing distance, the invisible wall that separated them at home. At night, Mei Hua would sometimes watch him as he read receipts at the kitchen table, his face lit by the harsh white glow of the overhead bulb. He never noticed her gaze. She'd wonder when the last time he looked at her, really looked at her, had been. The answer always hurt. She was still young, still alive, but she felt like she was fading. The loneliness didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, through quiet dinners, half-hearted conversations, and the realization that they hadn't shared laughter in years. It was a kind of emptiness that didn't shout. It whispered, and the more she ignored it, the louder it became. One evening, as rain streaked down the restaurant's front window, Mei Hua caught sight of a young couple sitting in the corner booth. The man reached across the table, wiped a drop of soup from his girlfriend's chin, and they both laughed. It was nothing extraordinary, but to Mei Hua, it was unbearable. That simple gesture, a touch, a glance, an unspoken affection, was something she hadn't felt in over a decade. That night, when she lay beside David, she could hear him breathing, steady and deep, already asleep. She turned away, staring into the darkness, realizing that it wasn't anger or betrayal that broke a marriage. It was silence, the kind that built up so quietly you didn't notice it until there was nothing left to say. And yet, somewhere beneath that silence, something in her heart still flickered, a faint, dangerous desire to feel alive again, a desire that, in time, would pull her toward the one person she was never supposed to love. The first time Mei Hua saw Lena was at the Portland International Airport on a gray afternoon in January 2020. The flight from Guangzhou had been delayed, and by the time the young girl appeared at the gate, she looked pale and exhausted, clutching a small suitcase and an old backpack. David stood stiffly beside his wife, his hands folded in front of him, expression unreadable. When Lena finally spotted him, she smiled with the kind of hesitant excitement that belongs to a stranger meeting family for the first time. David managed a quick nod, an awkward half-embrace, and a murmured, "Welcome home." For Lena, home was a word that felt foreign. She had spent her entire life in a rural village with her grandparents after her mother, David's first wife, died when she was little. David had sent money back for years, promising that one day he would bring her to America. Now that she was 18, that promise had finally come true. But as she followed her father and stepmother through the airport, jet-lagged and dazed by the strange new world around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't quite belong. The adjustment wasn't easy. Portland felt cold in every sense. Its rain, its silence, its unfamiliar rhythms. David expected discipline. He wanted her to help at the restaurant, study English, stay out of trouble. He spoke to her the same way he spoke to his kitchen staff, short, efficient commands. There were no warm hugs, no family dinners filled with laughter, just structure, just rules. But Mei Hua was different. She approached Lena with a quiet tenderness that surprised even herself. She remembered what it was like to arrive in America without understanding the language, to feel small and misplaced. She cooked Lena's favorite dishes from home, walked her through the city's markets, and helped her navigate life in this foreign place. She was patient where David was stern, gentle where he was distant. In those early months, something soft began to grow between them, something that felt maternal, healing. Lena began opening up to Mei Hua in ways she couldn't with her father. They would talk late into the night over cups of jasmine tea, about school, about the restaurant, about the loneliness that comes with starting over. Mei Hua listened, really listened, and for the first time in years, she felt needed. David, always busy with the restaurant, rarely noticed. To him, things were going well. The household was calm, business was steady, and his daughters seemed to be settling in. He didn't see the way Mei Hua's face lit up when Lena laughed, or how the two began sharing inside jokes, subtle touches, small smiles. For Mei Hua, that bond filled a void she hadn't even realized was so deep. Lena's presence brought warmth back into the house. They cooked together, watched movies, and turned the one-silent home into a place that almost felt alive. But beneath the comfort, there was something else taking root. Something fragile, confusing, and forbidden. It wasn't love yet, not the kind that destroys lives. It was connection, the kind born from shared loneliness, from two hearts that had gone too long without being seen. And though neither of them could have named it at the time, that connection was slowly shifting into something far more dangerous. Something that would change all three of their lives forever. It started so innocently that neither of them could say exactly when the line was crossed. Maybe it was a night they stayed up too late talking about home, about how both of them missed the smell of rain in China. Or maybe it was the day Lena came home from school crying after being mocked for her accent, and Mei Hua wrapped her arms around her, holding her longer than she should have. Whatever moment it was, it came quietly, disguised as comfort, disguised as love. By the spring of 2020, their relationship had shifted in ways neither dared to speak aloud. They spent more time together, shopping for ingredients, watching dramas after closing hours, sharing secrets they didn't share with anyone else. It wasn't lust that fueled it at first. It was understanding. Both had been lonely for so long that being seen, truly seen, felt intoxicating. Mei Hua saw in Lena the youth she had long lost, the warmth and curiosity that had faded from her own marriage. Lena, in turn, saw in Mei Hua kindness, a safety she had never known from her father. David was often away, handling suppliers, managing payroll, or simply too tired to notice. When he wasn't home, the house changed. Laughter returned. Music played softly from Lena's phone while they cooked together. They'd brush past each other in the kitchen, hands grazing by accident, glances lingering a beat too long. Sometimes their eyes met, and neither of them looked away. It wasn't spoken, but it was there, a current of electricity humming beneath the surface. One rainy Thursday evening, that current finally sparked. David was out of town on a supply run to Seattle. The restaurant had closed early because of the weather. Mei Hua poured 2 glasses of wine, something she rarely did, and they sat together in the living room, the only light coming from the dim lamp near the couch. The conversation started light, about customers, about Portland's endless rain, but it grew softer, more personal. Lena confessed that she felt invisible at school, that she didn't know who she was supposed to be. Mei Hua told her she once felt the same way, even as a grown woman. There was a pause then, one of those heavy silences that carried more meaning than words ever could. Mei Hua reached out to touch Lena's hand, meaning to comfort her, but when Lena didn't pull away, her fingers lingered. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. What happened next felt inevitable, like something that had been building for months. When they kissed, it wasn't desperate. It was hesitant, trembling, filled with the kind of ache that comes from years of emotional starvation. Afterward, they sat in stunned silence, both breathing hard, both terrified of what they had just done. Mei Hua whispered, "This can't happen again." Lena nodded, but they both knew it was a lie. The next evening and the one after that, they found themselves drawn together again, helpless against the pull. What had begun as a fleeting mistake became a secret that tied them tighter than either could bear. They lived 2 lives now, one for the world and one for each other. At the restaurant, they smiled for customers. At home, they whispered in the dark, careful not to wake David. Every touch was a risk, every glance a confession. The secrecy made it intoxicating, and the danger made it irresistible. But love built on fear cannot survive. Slowly, that sweetness began to rot from within. Mei Hua grew restless, paranoid that David would find out. She deleted messages, hid letters in the back of drawers, avoided his eyes at dinner. Lena, too, began to feel the strain, torn between the woman she loved and the father she wanted to please. Still, neither could stop. Every attempt to end it only led to another night, another promise they both knew they couldn't keep. And in the quiet of those stolen moments, as rain tapped softly against the windows, neither of them could see the tragedy that was already set in motion, the kind that starts with love and ends with blood. David Lin had always been a man of routine, steady, predictable, precise. But that very habit, the discipline that once held his life together, was what made him notice when things began to shift. It started small, subtle things that most men would have missed. The way Mei Hua's laughter had returned after years of silence, or how Lena suddenly spent less time outside her room and more in the kitchen when her stepmother was around. When he came home unexpectedly one afternoon, he caught them whispering in the living room. They jumped apart too quickly. It wasn't anything obvious, but something about the way they looked at each other, the flicker of panic, stuck with him long after. At first, David told himself it was nothing. He blamed his suspicions on exhaustion, on stress from the restaurant, on the simple awkwardness of having a teenage daughter and a wife trying to coexist. But the unease didn't go away. It grew. It followed him into his sleep, turned every glance, every laugh between them into a question mark. When he walked into a room, their conversation stopped. When he looked at Mei Hua, she smiled too quickly, too carefully. He tried to ignore it. He wanted to. After all, suspicion was a dangerous thing for a man like David, a man who believed in control, in order. But one night, as he sat alone in the restaurant office counting receipts, he saw Mei Hua's phone light up with a message. A simple text from Lena, short and casual, but the time, midnight, made his stomach twist. Something inside him shifted from doubt to dread. The next few days, he watched them more closely. He noticed how Mei Hua's phone never left her side, how she flinched whenever it buzzed. He noticed how Lena's voice softened when she spoke to her stepmother, the way her eyes lingered too long. All the tiny details he'd once ignored now screamed at him. Then came the breaking point. One night, when Mei Hua was in the shower, David picked up her phone. His hands were trembling, his heart pounding so loud he could barely hear. He told himself it was just to ease his mind, to prove he was imagining things. But when he scrolled through her messages, he found them, dozens of texts between her and Lena. They weren't explicit, but the affection, the longing between the lines was unmistakable. He froze, staring at the screen as if it might change. His throat went dry. His wife, his daughter, the betrayal ran deeper than anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something unnatural, something that broke every code he lived by. From that night on, something inside David began to unravel. He became quieter, colder. He watched them from behind unreadable eyes. Mei Hua sensed it, but she didn't know why. Lena grew nervous around him, her voice trembling whenever he spoke. David didn't confront them. Not yet. He wasn't ready. He was still collecting the pieces, still trying to decide what to do with the truth now lodged like a knife in his chest. But one thing was certain. The silence that had once defined their marriage was about to explode. And when it did, someone wouldn't survive it. It was a quiet Sunday evening in June 2021 when everything finally broke. The restaurant had closed early after a slow day, and the rain outside had begun to fall in that soft, relentless way that seemed to soak through the city's bones. Inside the Lin household, the air felt heavy, too still, too silent. David sat alone at the dining table, a small stack of papers and printed text messages spread out before him. He had spent the entire week collecting them. The late-night messages, the hidden photos, the letters he'd found tucked inside Mei Hua's closet, written in Lena's neat, careful handwriting. Each word was another wound. When Mei Hua and Lena came home from the restaurant that evening, they sensed something was wrong before a word was spoken. David didn't move, didn't greet them. He just said flat and quiet, "Sit down." The way he said it left no room for hesitation. They obeyed, exchanging nervous glances as they sat across from him. David's eyes were bloodshot, not from tears, but from sleepless nights. He looked at them the way a man looks at strangers wearing the faces of people he once loved. Without saying a word, he pushed the papers toward them. The messages, the letters, proof, the kind of evidence that doesn't allow denial. For a long moment, no one breathed. Mei Hua's face went pale. Lena's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. The only thing that filled the silence was the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock. David finally spoke, his voice low but shaking with fury. "How long?" Mei Hua's mouth trembled. "David, it's not what you think." He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing through the house. Don't lie to me now. Lena flinched, tears pooling in her eyes. It was my fault, she blurted out, desperate to take the blame. But that only enraged him more. Your fault? He snapped, turning toward her, his voice raw. You're my daughter. The word daughter hit the air like a curse. Mei Hua reached for him, sobbing. Please, it wasn't meant to happen. I was lonely, David. I was empty. You never saw me. Her words tumbled out between gasps, desperate, incoherent. I didn't mean to hurt you. David's face twisted, not in rage, but in something worse. Betrayal. Humiliation. He felt his chest tighten, his pulse hammering behind his eyes. He had built this life from nothing, sacrificed everything, only to have it collapse because of the two people he trusted most. You destroyed everything, he said quietly, almost to himself. Everything. For a moment, no one moved. The storm outside grew louder, wind battering the windows. Then David stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He began pacing, running a trembling hand through his hair, muttering in Mandarin under his breath, fragments of words that sounded like prayers or maybe curses. Lena tried to step forward to explain, but he turned sharply, eyes blazing. Stay back, he warned. She froze. Then, as if possessed by something darker than anger, David grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter. The room erupted in screams. Mei Hua rushed forward, throwing herself between him and Lena. Stop, please. Don't do this. But David's grief had already crossed the threshold into madness. He shoved her aside, his voice breaking. You ruined us. And then it happened. Fast, violent, irreversible. The knife flashed under the kitchen light, a blur of silver and blood. Mei Hua gasped, stumbled, and felt the floor. The sound of rain was drowned out by Lena's scream. She dropped to her knees, pressing her hands against the wound, but the blood kept coming, warm and endless. David froze, staring down at what he'd done, the knife clattering from his hand. In that instant, the man who had spent his whole life in control realized he had lost everything, his wife, his daughter, his soul. And as the sirens wailed in the distance, the only sound left in the room was a ragged echo of his own breath, breaking apart in the silence he had once mistaken for peace. By the time the paramedics arrived, the house looked like a nightmare painted in red and white. Mei Hua lay motionless on the cold kitchen floor, her blood pooling across the tiles, mixing with the shards of broken glass that had fallen during the struggle. Lena knelt beside her, shaking uncontrollably, her hands slick with blood as she pressed them against the wound that refused to stop bleeding. Her screams had already faded into a hoarse whisper by the time the flashing blue lights washed over the windows. David didn't run. He didn't even move. When the police burst through the door, they found him sitting on the floor against the wall, his hands resting limply on his knees, eyes wide and hollow. The kitchen knife lay several feet away. He said nothing as the officers ordered him to stand, nothing as they cuffed him, nothing as Lena's cries filled the room. It wasn't until they let him out into the rain that he muttered something under his breath, a single sentence in Mandarin that none of the officers understood. I have already lost. At the station, David confessed almost immediately. There were no denials, no excuses, no attempts to shift blame. He spoke calmly, describing the moment he snapped, his voice flat, detached, like he was reading someone else's story. When asked why he did it, he said only, because I couldn't carry it anymore. The detectives exchanged glances, no one quite sure he meant betrayal, the shame, or the years of silence that had built up like pressure inside a sealed jar. News of the murder spread quickly through Portland's Chinese community. The Lins had been well known, successful, respected, the kind of couple that symbolized the immigrant dream. The revelation of an affair between Mei Hua and her stepdaughter stunned everyone. The local papers ran headlines that bordered on sensational. Family's secret ends in bloodshed. Husband kills wife over forbidden affair. Customers stopped coming to the restaurant. Friends turned their backs. What had once been a symbol of success became a symbol of shame. The trial began in late fall, months after the murder. Reporters filled the courtroom, their cameras flashing as David was led in wearing a gray jumpsuit, wrist chained. Lena sat in the front row, pale and trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. She was both a witness and a victim, caught in a tragedy that had no winners. The prosecution built a simple but devastating case. David Lynn had discovered the affair, confronted his wife and daughter, and in a fit of rage, killed Mei Hua with intent. They argued it was an act of vengeance, not passion, a deliberate punishment for humiliation. They showed the jury the bloodstained letters, the text messages, the knife. Each piece of evidence told the same story: betrayal, rage, and murder. The defense, in turn, painted David as a man undone by emotional devastation. They spoke of his years of sacrifice, his cultural expectations, his quiet suffering. His lawyer argued that this was not premeditated murder, but a moment of temporary insanity, a husband's mind collapsing under unbearable shame. They played recordings of his police interview, where his voice cracked as he spoke about how he'd failed both as a man and as a father. Lena's testimony was the most haunting moment of the trial. She stood on the witness stand, hands trembling, eyes red from sleepless nights. She described the argument, the shouting, the flash of knife, her mother's last words, a whispered, "Run." The courtroom was silent. Even David couldn't look at her. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the air in the room felt suffocating. It took them 3 days to return a verdict. David Lynn was found guilty of second-degree murder, the jury concluding that while the act wasn't premeditated, it was intentional. The judge's sentence was firm: 25 years in state prison. No parole until at least 20 had been served. David nodded once, quietly, accepting it without protest. When the guards led him away, he didn't look back at Lena. She wanted to call out to him, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Outside the courthouse, rain fell again, just as it had that night. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Lena walked past them without a word. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. And whatever future she had left would forever be haunted by the sound of that knife slicing through the silence of their home. When the gavel came down and the courtroom emptied, it felt like the air itself had changed, thinner, heavier, as the entire city had exhaled and moved on, leaving only one person behind to carry the weight. For Lena Lynn, the world didn't end with her mother's death or her father's sentencing. It ended in the quiet moments that followed, when she realized there was no one left to call family. The weeks after the trial blurred together in fragments of grief and guilt. She packed what little she owned into a single suitcase and left Portland without saying goodbye to anyone. The house, their house, was sealed off, a crime scene no one wanted to talk about. Golden Moon Bistro was sold to another family, its familiar red lanterns replaced with new ones that carried none of the memories. Every trace of her parents was wiped clean, as if the city itself wanted to forget. Lena moved south to California, renting a small studio apartment outside Fresno under her mother's maiden name. She didn't tell anyone who she really was. In that new town, she was just another quiet immigrant girl working long hours at a cafe, smiling at strangers who would never know that her last name once made headlines. But at night, when the world went silent, the past crept back in, the sound of her father's voice cracking, the image of her mother's blood spreading across the kitchen floor, the guilt that no prayer could wash away. She thought often about Mei Hua, not as a woman who broke her father's heart, but as a person who had once made her feel seen, safe, loved. It was twisted, yes, but real. What they had shared was born out of loneliness and need, not evil. And that thought, however fragile, was the only way Lena could survive. She would sit on the floor of her small apartment and whisper, "I'm sorry," over and over, not knowing who she was apologizing anymore. As for David, prison became his world, a gray existence marked by silence and repetition. Inmates whispered about the restaurant man who killed his wife, but David barely heard them. He spent his days sweeping floors, folding laundry, and writing letters he never sent. The letters were always the same: apologies to Lena, confessions to Mei Hua, questions to God. He never expected forgiveness. He just needed to keep writing, as if each word could carve a small hole in the walls around him. Once, during a prison interview with a social worker, David was asked if he regretted what he'd done. He looked up slowly and said, "Regret isn't strong enough a word. I didn't just kill my wife. I killed everything that made me human." After that, He stopped speaking to reporters altogether. The world lost interest anyway. Another tragedy replaced his in the news cycle. Another headline took its place. Years later, Lena returned to Portland for the first time. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. The restaurant was gone, the street quieter than she remembered. She stood outside the old house. Fresh paint, new curtains, another family living there, and felt nothing. No tears, no rage. Just a dull ache of knowing that some places don't belong to you anymore. She drove to the river afterward, parked the car, and sat watching the water move beneath the bridge. It was peaceful, the kind of peace she'd been chasing for years. She whispered her parents' names one last time, then closed her eyes. The story of the Lynn family faded from public memory, but its echoes lingered, a cautionary tale whispered in community circles, about love that turned to guilt, about silence that turned to blood. And if you were to walk past that quiet street in East Portland today, you'd never know what happened inside that little house. You'd never guess that behind those painted walls once lived a family who lost everything. Not to hatred, but to the unbearable weight of love that no one dared to speak of.